Welcome back. This TWIF online presentation will discuss sources and the manner in which historians reconstruct the past. In other presentations, I've mentioned primary sources in passing and wanted to take a little extra time to outline what exactly makes a source primary or secondary, share a few examples of each, and discuss how this knowledge can help us become better consumers of information. Primary sources are first-hand accounts of events or topics. This means that primary sources are materials produced by people or groups directly involved in an event or topic, either as participants or as witnesses. This is important because historians rely heavily on primary sources to reconstruct the past. Primary sources come in many different forms, as documents, images, maps, works of art. In the next few slides, I will share a few examples from the Wayside collection and briefly discuss some of the information we can take from these sources. Journals and diaries are especially useful as primary sources because their authors kept, sometimes daily or weekly, accounts of everyday life. At the Wayside Inn, we are lucky to have a large collection of journals written by the staff of Longfellow's Wayside Inn in the early 20th century. These front door, or hostess diaries as they are sometimes called, were daily accounts of things like the weather, who visited the inn, and thoughts about what was happening in the world. Here we have a diary entry from November 3rd, 1930. If we jump down to the second paragraph, it reads, "Our schools are progressing onward and the children are keenly interested in their many activities. The pupils of the Mary Lamb School are preparing a program to commemorate Thanksgiving Day." This entry tells us quite a bit. First, it lets us know that children actually attended the one-room school we today call the Redstone Schoolhouse in 1930. The entry also lets us know that people called the school the Mary Lamb School at that time. Photographs and other images are also excellent primary sources, as they often capture how things and people looked at a particular moment in time. Here we have a photo included with the diary entry that I just shared in the previous slide of the Redstone Schoolhouse with children playing outside. Written beneath the photo was the caption, "The Merry Lambs at Play." So from this photo and the caption, we have additional evidence of students attending the school and some sense of what those children looked like. We also know from the caption that the kids were called Merry Lambs as a fun play on the name of the school. Letters and postcards are also wonderful as primary sources for historians. In a previous presentation, I discussed postcards at length, as well as some of the information we can get from them. Here we have an image of a postcard with the Redstone Schoolhouse on the front and some information about the school on the back, as well as a short type note. The back of this postcard tells us several interesting things. First, it is interesting because the note is typed and not handwritten, which is unusual for this sort of postcard. Second, this postcard has a note, but it is unsent. We know this because there is no postal stamp. We also know from the description that the school had yet another name, the Little Red Schoolhouse, in 1964 when this postcard was printed, and we know that from the copyright in the center of the back, which briefly explains the connection between the schoolhouse and the nursery rhyme, "Mary Had a Little Lamb." And this helps us to better understand the previous name of the school, the Mary Lamb School. Videos are yet another primary source form. Videos and films can give us useful information about the past, but we have to be careful because some videos are primary sources and some are secondary sources, which I will discuss in a few minutes. Both types of sources are useful, but sometimes it's important to think about the type of source that we are reviewing. On this slide, I've provided a link for an excerpt from a vintage film of everyday life at the Wayside Inn in the 1930s. The clip has no sound or narration, and for this reason it provides us with some raw footage and a sense of the landscape of the property and what types of activities people were involved in at the time. Objects, or what are sometimes called artifacts, are the last type of primary source that I want to discuss. On the left side of this slide is a picture of Jerusha Howe's pianoforte. This is an important item in the Wayside Inn collection because it is mentioned many times in stories about Jerusha Howe. To get a real sense of history, it is important to examine as many types of sources as possible, and objects allow us to see things with more dimension and with fewer filters, which is something I will discuss at the end of this presentation. I just shared a few examples of primary sources, but primary sources can come in many other forms, such as interviews, newspaper articles, which can also be secondary sources, birth, death, or marriage certificates, census records. As an aside on census records, please note that the 2020 census is going on right now, so please make sure your family has or will participate. Also, receipts of items purchased and sold, maps, literature. And literature is important because even fiction can tell us a lot about how people viewed things in the past. There are also paintings and other works of art. Social media posts are also a more recent form of primary sources because they are today's equivalent to the diaries of the past. So what is a secondary source? Secondary sources are quite simply texts such as books, articles, or documentary films written or created by people who were not witnesses to or participants of events. What is important to know about secondary sources is that good secondary sources are supported by primary sources in their interpretation of history. Again, there are many types of secondary sources, but I want to highlight just a few of the most common. The first and most common type of secondary source is a book. For example, the book, A History of Longfellow's Wayside Inn, was written by Brian Plum after many months of reviewing the primary sources in the Wayside Inn archives. He pored over birth, death, and marriage records, legal documents, letters, photographs. He examined artifacts and consulted other secondary sources to reconstruct the history of the inn. And we know this because he provides an extensive bibliography. I mentioned a few minutes ago that films can be both primary and secondary, as can many other types of sources. But a film is a secondary source when it includes editing and interpretation of something and not just raw footage of an event. On the left side of this slide is a link to a documentary film about the history of the Wayside Inn created in 1990. The film itself is a secondary source because it is edited and narrated to tell a specific story, but it includes clips of interviews that are first-hand accounts of events, including footage from interviews of Frank Coppice, the man in this screenshot, who was one of only 11 innkeepers in the entire history of the Wayside Inn. This film provides us and future historians with incredibly valuable information. Like primary sources, there are many other types of secondary sources, some of which I mentioned before and others that I have listed here. And because of technology, there are many new types of sources, such as websites and podcasts, that we can add to our ever-growing list. The important question to ask when assessing the value of secondary sources is what primary sources, if any, were used to create a historical account. A good secondary source might consult and reference other secondary sources, but will always go back to primary sources. So, which type of source, you might ask, is better in providing us with the truth about history? I have the word truth in quotes here because I often wonder if we can ever really find truth in history. I think we are more likely to find facts and information that allow us to get closer to what we might call truth, but truth itself is something hard to fully reconstruct. But to answer the question, which type of source is better or more truthful, my answer is, it depends. First, the types of sources you consult should depend on your research question and what you want to learn. And second, you should never, ever, in trying to answer a research question of any type, rely on any one source. Let's look at an example. In another presentation, I talked about the legend of Jerusha Howe and read an abridged story from a magazine titled Jerusha Howe Spinster. If my research question was, who was Jerusha Howe? This story would tell me very little about the real person. It is a secondary source written by someone who did not know Jerusha while she was alive and relied on the information provided by someone else retelling a story. However, if my research question was, what are the roots of the legend of Jerusha Howe? This magazine story would be a great secondary source. I would still need to consult primary sources such as birth records and journals to separate fact from fiction in this article, but it would still provide good information. The important thing to know is that all sources, regardless of whether they are primary or secondary, are not always true. Think about modern-day primary sources like social media posts or online news. Do people always post exactly what is going on in their lives, or only what they want us to see, hear, or read? And with social media specifically, the content is often filtered. Think about Snapchat or Instagram filters and how they changed the appearance of things in photos. In much the same way, old-timey sources are also filtered. Someone might have written a diary entry that leaves out important facts or fails to give a balanced perspective. And online news, like the news of the past, might have a specific point of view that it is trying to get across. People often misinterpret the truth of their own lives, sometimes unintentionally, other times intentionally. And this is really important to remember in the wake of ever-changing technology that allows us to filter and change content that was previously more difficult to alter. So please be a good consumer of information and ask questions when you come across something that feels off. The Stanford History Education Group has some great lesson plans and resources for families looking to learn more about how to go about doing this and thinking more like a historian. Practice being a historian at home by doing a primary source analysis. Start by finding an object in your house, preferably something that's older, maybe something that's older than you are, and investigate its history. Please make sure you get permission if it's something that's fragile or valuable before you start. Now take the object and place it before you and look at it carefully, and make notes on what you know about it. What is it, first of all? Note its size, measure it if you can. Note the color, shape, weight. If you can't weigh it, maybe you just note if it's light or heavy. And what do you already know about its history? And then go and ask family members some questions about the object. How did your family come to have it? Was it purchased or given to the family? Is there a special story about where it came from? Do you have some old photos with the object in use that you can include in your documentation? And then take a photo or draw a picture of it. Before cameras were something that most people had, people would have a notebook and they would just sketch the object in question. So you can do that always. And then if you'd like, you can go a little further and write a story about it and share it with us. You can email it to twif@wayside.org. Any stories or pictures that you send will be put on our online bulletin board.